Melee versus ranged. Braindead versus science. Which one is harder? Melees can do the rotation on the move, but when they move too far, they just cannot hit their target. Ranged, on the other hand, has to interrupt their casts anytime they have to move at all. And all of these just make each one of them harder than the other in certain situations. Difficulty, first of all, is subjective, and even so, I will clarify my position on difficulty and shed some light on aspects of encounter design that maybe you haven't thought about that makes one harder than the other. And we're going to talk about certain aspects of World of Warcraft that we can judge which one is harder or easier than the other. And the first one on the list is ABC, always be casting. And here, the one that has it worse is range. Now hear me out. Moving stops casts. Pretty simple, right? Now melee can move and cast at the same time, so optimizing positioning has close to no punishment for melee since you can just rotate around the dragon, dodging the tail and the breath while constantly DPSing, while obviously range has to break their casts and rotation to reposition or move in any way, shape or form. And we are talking about generic and general and universal movement because there are specific movement that essentially can be harder for melee, and we're gonna get to that in this next point, which is uptime. Now, uptime fundamentally is easier to maintain on range than it is on melee. And that's because, let's take a look at this little neat paint representation of range and melee. Now, if you're a range player, you're this little dot right here, and the reach that you have over the encounter, over the battlefield, over the battleground is, let's say, this big, right? And whatever your target is, as long as it's within this, it can move all it wants. You can always hit it without ever having to do anything else. While for melee, they have to chase it around. They might break melee range. They might not be able to use an ability. So you could say that it is easier for range since the reach of melee is like this little tiny circle. This is nothing. Like, what are you gonna do? Now, there is a caveat which ultimately makes the uptime thing actually harder on range than it is on melee. And that is because the target cannot leave this reach area during that range, and it usually does. Now, during that time, if it does leave the reach range of a range player, then the range player will have to move and break their ABC. Now, you could say it can happen the same for melee, but if we're going to talk about that, we need to mention the types of movements that the target can have that are present in World of Warcraft. And that usually refers to the speed of the movement. Usually, more often than not, the speed of the movement is essentially walking speed. It's usually when the tank kites things around. Whenever the tank takes the boss from point A in the fight to the point B in the fight, and because the tank moves at regular melee speed, then the boss will move at regular melee speed, hence melee will essentially just walk with the target and keep their uptime and suffer close to zero penalties since, once again, they can DPS while moving. There's another type of movement, of course, which is prevalent, not as much, but it does happen and can probably hurt melee more, but it's not obvious, and that is instantaneous movement. That is teleporting, that is blinking. Sometimes targets move really quickly from point A to point B, or we can have council fights where we have to swap from one target to another, and that target is on the other side of the arena or the other side of the encounter. Either way, who has it worse has nothing to do with melee or range and more to do with actual classes and specs mobility. So it can essentially be anybody's game here. For instance, mages have blinks, warriors have leaps, so they can essentially close the distance, and it doesn't really matter that one is melee and one is ranged, while shadow priests have and Death Knights have which means nothing, essentially. That means nothing. They're very mobile, and they both suffer equally, or they just suffer enough where it doesn't matter who has it worse because they both have it bad. There's also probably the most prevalent type of movement, which is slight movement, slight repositioning, essentially optimizing battlefield awareness because, sometimes you know when a mechanic is coming in, when a breath is coming in, when, let's say, somebody puts a puddle there and a beam has to be kited into the puddle, so you just want to get out of the way of the person that's going to do that in about a couple of seconds, so you have to reposition. And that usually is easier for melee because that repositioning implies you're going to be around the target. Because for ranged, repositioning means you have to squeeze in little stutter steps or strafes in between your casts during the global cooldown. Now, mechanically, that can probably be harder, and I think it is, since it implies more than what melees actually do, but more often than not, that can also impact your rotation if you mess it up. It can punish you a little bit more. Sure, ranged classes have a lot of instant casts, some of them, that can essentially make movement easy. Then we go back down to specs, which makes each side irrelevant again because you have melees with repositioning outside of Death and Decay that can hurt them while still having uptime on the boss, while you have range that can just reposition with Warlock, for instance, shooting out conflagrates and putting its feet 5 yards away. But at the same time, maybe you don't want to use that conflagrate because you want to time it with some Chaos Bolt cast, and you then lose the backdraft buff to your Chaos Bolts. So once again, it comes down to specs and classes, but fundamentally, it seems like range have it slightly worse than melee. And of course, we do have to talk about responsibilities, mechanics, duties, whatever reason it is for a raid leader to have your class/spec into the raid to give you something to do, or even in dungeons when it comes to your utility kit. Now, once again, this ties closely to your ABC whenever you have to do any type of other stuff which is not DPS, which more often than not will make it harder for range than it is for melee, and here's why. First of all, any kind of responsibilities ties closely to your ABC, always be casting. What this essentially means is always be casting damage abilities. Now, melees can access their crowd controls, dispels, and other tools instantly since there's no inherent cast time in their spec to begin with. However, melees might not be in range to apply their responsibilities, giving the ball of who has it harder to probably melees in that situation. But that can also happen to range, and responsibilities are either delegated ideally according to accessibility. So for instance, hunters are known to do a lot of mechanics in the rake and they can just do it way easier than anybody else, and that is more prevalent for range, giving them essentially more to do overall than melee. But that can also be deferred to mobile classes, which usually have a lot of things to do. That goes down to druids, monks, and demon hunters who can get from A to B really quickly. And although that sometimes happens, in an ideal situation, because we are talking about ideal situations, which means a pre-made group, a guild raid, or a group of M+ pushers with friends, you want to optimize your damage. And because you want to optimize your damage output, since that's fundamentally the most important thing in an encounter in World of Warcraft, and maybe we can have a video on that as well, healing and tanking is not more important than damage, since more damage means target dies faster, encounters dies faster, you get a better timer on your key, and you get to complete the content, meaning less damage the tank takes, less damage that needs to be healed by the healer. So, because the efficient groups want to optimize their damage, they will essentially delegate responsibilities to classes/specs that will suffer the least when having to do them, and that usually goes to range, because range have a bigger reach on the battleground. We talked about this a couple of minutes ago, but they still lose because they have to break their ABC. Even though they can do it easier than melee, they do it more often than melee, hence most of the time range have it worse. Whether or not they're mobile, range usually tends to have more mobile classes than melee, with the odd exception. And this is of course mostly talking about raids, but hey, we can talk about dungeons as well. But in dungeons, people are mostly stacked, so whatever issues melee normally have, where, you know, they cannot get to their target really quickly, is essentially destroyed. Since everybody's stacked, melees are rarely out of range of their targets to do anything, to shoot a stun, to do a fear, to charge, to root, to do anything like that. The fact that ranged DPS essentially have a wider presence on the battlefield implies their control over it is larger and their options are more accessible, hence why they will mostly be the ones to do the polymorphs, the traps, the range interrupts, the bait mechanics even, away from the groups. If melee at any point has to deal with any of these instead of range, then once again melee gets to be way harder than range. However, that doesn't normally happen, as we just pointed out. And if it does end up happen, we have to accept the situation can happen on the other side as well, where ranged DPS have to do melee mechanics, and that can once again throw the hot potato ball of who has it worse again between classes or specs or players, since it's very hard to judge who has it worse, melee doing range mechanics or range doing melee mechanics. Probably melee doing range mechanics, but that doesn't happen very often. And of course, since the video cannot just be simple, so you guys can just bring the pitchforks neatly and conveniently in the comment section, there are exceptions to the rule. These exceptions always exist, which make the topic of this video a little bit harder to dissect. First of all, it's the contemporary content, or essentially the seasonal content in World of Warcraft tends to sometimes favor one over the other, more or less arbitrarily, where Season 1 of Dragonflight, for instance, was dog shit for casters. and Season 2 is dog shit for melee, where certain raids or dungeons favor one over the other, making the difficulty between the two once again interchangeable. The hot potato situation. And we can apply this to players' subjective perception will also change which one ends up harder. The player's proclivity and affinity towards one role over the other will change which one ends up being harder. Because as a melee brain player, I find melee is incredibly easy to do and play mechanically, since I just play 80% of my time melee. And whenever I go to range, my brain has to wrap its head around over all of the ABC and the where is the target? It's over there. Do I have to like stay in range of the target and the boss and the target and then CC that and then go back on the boss? Like, that doesn't come as easy to me as it does with melee. So that's probably subjective bias. Now there's also spec and class design that can change it, and this usually has to do with the patch or the expansion. Sometimes specs and classes are designed in such a way where it's easier to do certain things or harder to do other things. Combat encounter versus utility kit can also change who has it worse, and we can see this predominantly in Mythic Plus, where classes like priests have a lot more tools to do with a lot more things that happen in dungeons than other classes. So if you have a priest, you might have an easier time doing the content, but the priest itself might have a lot more to do, hence might be harder to play a priest in those situations. Vice versa, the group composition can change it, where if you are not in a party with said priest, it doesn't matter what you play, you have to do things that otherwise would come easier for a priest to do, making it harder to play what you're playing, whether it is a melee or a range class. And finally, of course, player skill can change it, which, of course, if we apply this to the entire video, then the topic is essentially moot. But player skill can indeed change it, whether you're just naturally super good at range and horrible at melee. You might think range is easier than melee, or maybe you're just super good at everything and you don't think anything in World of Warcraft is hard. That doesn't mean you're right, that just means that's how you play the game and you're just a good player, and hey, props to you. As such, both are hard and both are easy in a realistic environment, but with as an objective approach as possible, range has it slightly harder, hence why I believe range is harder than melee. But hard is not the be-all and all. Hard can be fun, hard cannot be fun. But sometimes, unfortunately, harder is just annoying, and we pointed it out in our Mythic Plus review video that's on the screen right now, which you can click, where we talk about why Mythic Plus is indeed a problem, why it needs to change, or it can be a dying content for a lot of the players. Now, I know there's a bunch of you who love pushing keys, but that's just 5 of you. The other 1 million just don't like doing Mythic Plus. And you don't want to know why? Then just watch this video.